session. My name is Krishna, and I have about 25, close to about 25 years of experience in the IT industry. So I'd say quite seasoned. So I don't know whether you want to call it quite expertise or whatever, but it's quite seasoned professional in the area of technology. So I have been associated with databases right from the beginning of my career. Uh, Started out as a database developer, then went on to kind of design databases and became a data architect. Later, I moved over to database administration, and I also moved to data warehousing. So quite a bit of stuff. In the middle, I also dabbled with data governance, audit compliance, and stuff like that. The last 5 years, I've been trying to focus on this area called as data science and more specifically machine learning. I mean, what fascinates me is, the amount of opportunities which are out there, for folks who are good in this area. So that's a very short introduction about myself. And before I even get started with the presentation, I would like to kind of set the expectation that this is not a very technical webinar as such, because in 90 minutes there's absolutely no way you can cover machine learning, leave alone a single topic in machine learning, right? So the idea is, for people or for ML enthusiasts, or I'm not say ML enthusiasts, for people who are looking at machine learning or data science as a career, like what is out there for them? What is it that they are expected to kind of know before they kind of jump into this? And is this the right time for them to jump into this particular field, right? I mean, so we will just talk about that. And, if there is any specific requirement in terms of technology or something, please reach out to Stalwart. I think, they probably will be able to guide you better. So having said that, let me get started. Uh, so as I said, this is an overview session, not definitely not a technical or an in-depth session. So we just finished with my introduction, so I'll just skip on to the next slide. So this webinar is it's all about understanding how AI and ML evolved. Now, obviously, there is a lot of content. I will make this content available to Stalwart. Probably they'll help you download it for your personal readings, right? So I'll talk a little bit about AI and machine learning, its history and where all it's applied, right? Some of the popular tools, languages, and libraries which are used in the area of machine learning. And then we will delve a little bit into what are the different types of areas you will get into when you start learning, machine learning, right? So we will not go into any algorithm specifically, nor will we get into any code, but we will just talk about some applications and how this whole thing works. Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide. If there are any questions and answers, I mean, we can probably have a 10 or a 15-minute session at the end of this webinar to kind of, handle those. And in case I'm not able to answer any of your queries, I can assure you that, we will definitely take down your questions and put up our responses at the earliest. So when you talk about AI and ML, right, I mean, most of us, probably feel that AI ML is the latest and the hottest thing out in the IT industry, right? The fact is that this is a very, very old, a thought process or a subject area which has been there, right, and has been actively in the academic circles since the 1950s. Okay, so since the 1950s, man has always been curious to understand how they can make more intelligent systems, right? And then predominantly till the 1990s, this was more or less an academic pursuit. So people who were in universities who were doing their PhDs, they probably were dabbling with this. And then you obviously had research labs in certain big corporates, right? I mean, they were actually focusing on some of these areas, right? Now, in the 90s is when this kind of became a little popular. It went out of the university circle. And in the last 10, 15 years, right? I mean, it's become really, really popular. And in the last 5 years, probably you have been seeing a lot of applications of this in the industry. And, and you probably are also seeing a lot of, the job positions, the job openings specifically in this particular area. So what has led to all of this? So before we get into that, a little bit about the history of AI and ML, right? So we start off with the first mechanical calculating unit, which was built by Pascal in 1642. So 1642, you had the first mechanical calculator which was built. And as you can see, a lot of things happened, right? And I mean, I'm not going to go into all of these things into detail, but I will just say that, I will still say that even though this is such an old concept which is being developed and which is evolving, we still have a long way to go in terms of saying that, before we say that, okay, AI and ML is mature now, it is stable now, so we'll have to look at something else. So we are not there yet. So what does that mean for us? It means that if any one of you is looking at moving into this area, which is into data science or which is into AI and ML, this still is the right time for you to get into it. Okay. And it's only the last 4 or 5 years that we are seeing that a lot of universities have started offering the master's program or the postgraduate program in AI and ML, right? I mean, before that, we did not have any of this unless and until you are a computer science major. And especially if you go outside India to study, then probably there is a scope for you to do something on this area. Now, technology has evolved, and so has this specific area as well. Now, where is AI and ML applied, right? I mean, I'm going to talk to you about some of the common applications. I don't want to get into the specifics of what is happening in corporates at this point of time, okay? But if you, I mean, all of us use smartphones, and all of us have, various shopping apps like Amazon or Flipkart, okay, or yeah, Alibaba or anything, right? When you go in, right? I mean, the moment you buy something, you see a recommendation. It says that people who bought this also have purchased this, right? That is a vague form of, an AI and ML application, an ML application. It's basically a recommendation system out there, right? When you get onto the road, you put the map out there, right? I don't know how many of you, most of you would have used Uber or Ola, right? But when you get onto the traffic, sometimes it kind of re-navigates and readjusts the map and tells you, right? That is nothing but an application of AI and ML, where it looks at what is the shortest route available for you to reach your destination, right? Then you obviously have, Alexa from Amazon, Siri from Apple, right? And Google Now from Google, right? So when you look at all of these are your AI assistants, okay? Then the one of the most popular or the most widespread application of AI ML is basically in the area of anomaly detection, right? When you have data coming in, if you detect an anomaly before it becomes an issue, you can basically track it. I mean, that's typically used for credit card frauds and stuff like that, where they look at your spending patterns, and if there is a change in the spending pattern, then it kind of flags it up. It flags it up, and then probably you receive a call from the credit card company immediately saying that, hey, we detected a huge spend on your card. Is it really you, or should we block the card? Right. That's one area. Chatbots. I mean, all of us use chatbots. I mean, now almost every website gives you this chatbot capability, right? The very few chances, less than 5%, where actually a human is sitting and responding to you. 95% it is possible that you are chatting with a software, okay, where you provide some details and the software tries to get you the details, and only when your thing becomes a little complex, your questions become a little complex, does the software kind of direct you to a human agent, right? Gaming, right? I mean, gaming is one area which actually started using the ML and the AI concepts even much before it became popular outside. Okay, and I'll tell you how gaming is actually helped us as well. Social media. I mean, I don't have to tell you about this. You go to Facebook, you go to LinkedIn, right? I mean, obviously you get recommendations on whether you want to connect to this person or this person and stuff like that. But how does it do that? It knows that because now it uses a lot of complex algorithms in the background, and it is able to understand that you have certain preferences. Sometimes your recommendations are made based on your patterns, usage patterns of the application, or sometimes it is just based on the fact that somebody else knows that same person. So there are chances that you might know that person as well, right? So that is association rule mapping, right? Then you have language translators. Now, language translators, if you see what they do, earlier it used to be a word-to-word translation, and that probably wouldn't make a lot of sense. But now that is also evolving. So ML and AI has gone to a level where they not only translate it, but they also make it meaningful for you to understand. Now, obviously, there's still scope for growth in some of these areas, but we still are at a place at least where we can start using them. right? Banking, a lot of the banking activities can be done in terms of, like, for example, if somebody is applying for a credit card, right? I mean, like, do you kind of approve a credit card based on the ratings or the spending patterns? Now, if the rating is not favorable, do you look at the spending patterns and the repayment patterns, right? I mean, so those are some of the things. The same thing, if there is, something which is kind of fishy with respect to the person's spending limits, so what action should you take? So all of these things are simple examples of use of this technology in ML and healthcare. ML and banking. We talk about healthcare. Healthcare is one area where AI and ML can play a great role. Now, we have been hearing a lot about robotic surgeries and stuff like that. Now, what is very interesting is that I would say about 2 years back, Google was actually working on something called as the Google Health API, right? And one discovery that they came up was respect to the eye scans, the scan of your eye, right? So based on the scan of your eye, based on some of the parameters that the algorithm was able to make out, they were able to predict whether this person is likely to be susceptible to a heart attack or not. Normally, blood pressure is one of the things that can also be detected by an ophthalmologist, but this was not in the case of a high blood pressure patient or something, but they were able to establish a correlation, right? Fault prevention, sentiment analysis, image recognition, natural language generation, robotics advertising, right? I mean, these are all many applications of AI. Now, the question is, it also matters as to what is the domain you're working in and what is the scope for ML and AI out there, right? I mean, AI cannot replace everything. AI definitely cannot replace everything, but you also have to be aware of the organization that you are associated with, what is their domain, is there a scope for you to apply machine learning or artificial intelligence out there. I'll move on to the next slide. So why is AI and ML so popular now? I mean, all these days it was not popular, even though, as I said, it's been fairly active in the academic circle since the 1950s. The first thing that you have to keep in mind is that all of these things work with a lot of data, with a lot of data, right? I mean, like the machine learning algorithm needs to read huge amounts of data for it to kind of understand the relationship and then make predictions. Now, in the last 15-20 years, you have the big data ecosystem which has evolved, where you not only look at structural data which is coming to you from databases or spreadsheets, you're also looking at a lot of unstructured data, which is nothing but your text data, right? Earlier, people would always feel that, there's no point in retaining email because email is not providing helpful information, I mean, which can be retained and processed later. But now with evolving technologies, we can also, kind of condense and compress the content of emails and also save them for not only from a record keeping perspective, but also to understand the conversations, right? So there's a lot of software libraries which are open source, which are available right now for us to try out a lot of the machine learning stuff, right? I mean, in those days, you only had to rely on commercial libraries which are available, and most of these would either be restricted to the academia or they would be extremely expensive. But now with R language, the Python language, all coming out, so there are so many open source libraries which are available, which are just absolutely free, and you can download and you can install and use them. So that kind of makes it easier for you to come up with the models to predict. Reduced cost of storage, right? I mean, today, I mean, most of us probably have a 64 gig or a 128 gig, storage available in our mobile phones, right? And here, obviously, that is because one, technology has evolved so much that you are able to compress so much of data in such a small space. Two, the cost of these components has also come down drastically. Okay, I mean, I have heard scenarios where once upon a time, I would say probably in the 1980s or something like that, a 1 GB or a 10 GB disk would probably cost you something like $30,000 or $40,000. It was so expensive out there. But today, all of this is so cost effective. Okay. One of the main reasons why I said gaming has played a role with respect to all of this is because if you have looked at gaming laptops or gaming PCs, they have something called as a GPU. Okay, graphical processing unit. Okay, now what we discovered is that GPUs help you run your algorithms on your personal laptop. So GPUs provide you higher levels of computing capability, and they also help you run the models, especially for that training the models on your laptop itself. This is not possible. I mean, when you try to run models or when you try to train your model, you will need a powerful laptop. I mean, still we have not gone to the level where it can run on a normal laptop, but you will still need a powerful laptop. And that is one of the reasons, if you're probably looking for a laptop or a PC to buy right now, one of the features that is specified out there is, this has got so much of GPU, right? The last thing that I wanted to talk about is the Internet of Things. Now, Internet of Things is nothing but making your components aware and connecting all of them to the internet so that they can communicate with each other. Now, what does this mean? This means that every component that you have connected to the internet is generating data, and somewhere that data is getting stored, right? And while there is a level of intelligence that can be built into these components, electronic components, like for example, somebody is walking out of the house, they'll switch off all the lights, right? If you know that the person has moved out of the garage, then bring down the garage thing, right? If you detect movement inside the house when a person is supposed to be outside, then alert that person, right? All of this is possible through Internet of Things and some intelligent computing. And this can be established easily using machine learning and AI capabilities. Okay, so these are some of the reasons. I'm not saying this is all the reasons, but these are some of the reasons why AI and ML is popular right now. Because one, you have the power to kind of try out things on your personal laptop, assuming that it's a good laptop. Second, you have lots and lots and lots of data, right, which is getting generated, which is available for you. I mean, today you can go to any website, especially websites like Kaggle, and download data sets which run into terabytes of data, right? So, that's just an example, right? So you have access to so much of data. Third thing is obviously reduced cost of storage. And fourth, the libraries are all free. Most of them are free and are available to you for use. So before we even go further, right? I mean, into talking what are the various algorithms and all, we need to understand what are the AI and ML concepts built on. Okay, and as I said, I'm not going to go deep into any of these things, even though it might sound technical. I'm as far as possible. I'm trying to be non-technical here. Okay, so AI ML is actually based on mathematics, statistics, and optimization methods. Okay. Now, again, you may say, oh, mathematics, statistics means, does it mean that I need to do a master's degree or something like that? Not really. If you're good in your fundamentals of mathematics till your 12th standard, then you are good. Optimization method is something that you may not learn in your 12th standard, but that is something that can be easily picked up. Okay, but mathematics and statistics, whatever you have learned in school, right, especially for folks who have been preparing for engineering exams and all, that level of mathematics and statistics is good enough. So I will not go deep, as I said, but let me also talk about what are the various career options which are available for people in AI ML space, right? I mean, when you say, okay, I am a data scientist, or I am part of a data science project, or I work in an organization which is dealing with data science, what could that mean? You could be an AI or an ML researcher. Now, I'll just spend a minute or two just talking about each of these profiles so that you understand, about them, and also are able to associate what you are doing today with what you probably can be doing, right? So the first one is an AI and ML researcher. Now, typically these are like the creme de la creme guys, right? I mean, typically they are either from the academia, okay, or they would have had a PhD, or they are working in some research labs. Now, what do these guys do? They kind of either come up with new algorithms completely, or they know that tweaking a particular algorithm will help solve your business problem. So obviously these guys at a minimum will have a PhD, okay, and they also would have a very good understanding of how this whole thing works, how the algorithm works, and how it kind of gives you superior results. And three, obviously they will be smart enough to understand your business problem and propose an algorithm for you. Okay. Now, for example, I mean, like, it is, I'm aware of a particular scenario where some professors from IIT, I think it was IIT Madras, were involved in solving a problem for an oil rig in, I think, somewhere close to Saudi Arabia or UAE, somewhere there. Okay. So there was a problem where, I think the particular at a particular temperature, the engines would stop working, and they were trying to solve it for a long time. They were not able to solve it, so they were trying to see if it can be proactively predicted. So I don't know how the IIT folks got engaged there, but I think it was a 2-year project where 1 year the IIT professors were just spending their time collecting the data and understanding the domain. The second year, they came up with an algorithm, okay, which was implemented by a set of programmers, and that algorithm was fine-tuned, and it later led to a stage where that particular organization or that oil company was able to kind of predict and take the relevant steps before the engines kind of halted. So you can understand what kind of a capability these individuals would have had in terms of their academic upbringing, right? The second is the ML model developer. Okay, now this is not the ML researcher, but this is the person who will build your model for you. What do I mean by building the model for you, right? I mean, there's an algorithm, you have your data, you have to make the algorithm conversant with your data, and that happens inside an ML model, right? So you build a model and you train that model to use your data, you tune the parameters of the algorithm, and then you have a model in place. Okay, so that model developer is the next closest role that you can get to, if you're not an AI and ML researcher. Data/ETL professional, right? I mean, this is a common thing, right? Now, let me assure you that in a data science project or in an ML project, almost 60% of your time, of the entire project time, goes into collecting the data and making sure that it is the correct data for your model. Okay, this is the cliche, proverb that they say, where they say garbage in, garbage out, right? So you cannot build a great model if your data is incorrect. If your data is not relevant to the problem that you are solving, then your model will not be able to do anything about it. Okay, and this data comes from multiple sources. So here, when I say data ETL professional, it is just a person who's helping you get that data. It could come from multiple databases, data warehouses, or multiple feeds or whatever, right? So it can come from multiple places. So that is what this person is helping you do it. UI programmer is, the model developer will build a model and give you. So the model will take some inputs and it will probably give out a prediction, right? Now, obviously, it cannot be so, like a bare metal application. So there would be an application where there's a call made to this model with the parameters, with the arguments, and the result is probably taken by the application and then taken over, right? So that's a UI programmer. So typically, it could be a .NET, it could be a Java programmer, it could be anyone. Then you also have an ML ops engineer. Now, why do you need an ML ops engineer? Now, the thing is that once you deploy your model in production, right? I mean, the ML model developer, the ML researcher, these guys and all will walk out to the next project. Okay. Now, there would be a challenge because as and when your data patterns are changing, your model also needs to be trained. The model needs to be retrained, right? And when it is retrained, right, you will need an ML ops engineer to help you with that. So your ML ops engineer will help you ensure that your model is retrained, and at the same time, any changes to the model that needs to be done will be handled by this particular role. Now, the last one is actually the most important one, the business analyst or the data reader or the data analyst. Okay, I mean, there are different terms which are used for the same role. Now, this is the person who understands the business problem. Okay, this is also the person who's able to look at the various data points which are available in your system, right? And say that, okay, this data point influences or can influence the outcome. Or he or she will say that this data point will not be able to influence the outcomes, so let's ignore it, right? So they are the ones who are really responsible, who will actually probably do something like a data quality check for the data that you are using. They'll also do a data validation to make sure that the data that you're trying to pull in is kind of relevant, right? They can also be the people who will take your output, the output of your ML model, go back to the business and explain to them that this is the model's output and what it means in terms of business actions or decisions for them. Okay, so this is a, I would say, a highly visible role where this person is not only involved in understanding the problem, but this person is also responsible for you know uh, interpreting the results of your ML model and sharing it with the stakeholders or the decision makers. Now, these are the various roles that are available to you in a data science project. So, I mean, sometimes, people tend to call themselves as a data scientist, irrespective of whatever role that they are involved in here, right? But typically, the way we should look at it is, if you're looking purely at an ML perspective, it's only the ML ops engineer, ML model developer, and ML researcher, or AI ML researcher, who is typically this one, right? The others are just people with, their experience. But having said that, they are equally important for this particular project. I mean, we should not discount their contributions to this. Next, let me move on to the phases in an AI ML project. Typical AI ML project. Okay. So there are multiple phases. I mean, like, again, some of these will overlap. Some of these may not be in the organization that you are associated with, right? But certain things that you need to keep looking at is the problem definition, right? I mean, first and foremost, you have to basically find out what is the problem that you're trying to solve. Because if you do it wrong here, all this is just, all this exercise is basically, is in vain, is being done in vain, right? So your problem definition is extremely important. Second is research, right? So when you say research, a couple of things, right? I mean, first thing is that, okay, I have my problem definition, but is this a feasible project for me to work on? Okay, you should never start thinking in terms of what algorithms I will start to use or implement when you are in these stages, because that way your thought process is clouding your judgmental senses, right? So basically what you should do is you should actually forget the fact that you are bringing in machine learning here, and you just try to see whether is it possible for us to first solve this problem in the first place. Then we'll talk about what technologies we bring in, like whether it's going to be Python or it's going to be R or it's going to be something else, right? We'll talk about all of those things later. The third stage is your data aggregation, scrapping or mining. So basically, this is where you kind of identify what your sources of data is, and you start pulling in the data. Right? Again, this is where you use your ETL developers or ETL programmers, right? Fourth is your data preparation stage, which is also called the pre-processing and the augmentation phase. Now, again, there's a lot of factors. There's an activity which we refer to as EDA, or exploratory data analysis, right? When we do data science projects. So all the data preparation, pre-processing, augmentation, all comes into that part, right? So where you identify what is relevant, what is not relevant. You identify identifying the number of outliers, whether it makes sense or not. Then check out what is your missing data and how are you going to populate your missing data, right? I mean, those are the various things that you need to look at. Then you might find that, let's say there are about 10 categories of data that you're looking at in the data set, 10 categories of something. Like, let's say, if I had to look at it from a geographic perspective, let's say that I have very few records available for, let's say, the Northeast region, but I have lots and lots of records which is available for the other parts of the country, right? So I cannot take those few records and use it as is, because if I use it as it is, right, then the algorithm will become biased in kind of always putting a lower weight for the data which is coming from the Northeast region. So somewhere I'll have to figure out how to kind of supplement that. How do I augment it, right? So those are the various things that need to be done, right? And then the next stage is you kind of start building your model. This is where you write your Python code or R code or whatever, right? See, I can assure you that the actual model code will never cross 50 or 60 lines. The actual model code will never cross 50 or 60 lines because everything is available to you through a library. Okay. Now, where you're going to spend your time is you would have spent about 60% of your project time prior to this particular step, and then you will spend time in training the model. Now, as I said, this is completely, I would say still intensive in terms of CPU and, processing capabilities and stuff like that, right? So model training is one area where you might spend quite a bit of time, right? Where you kind of expose your model to the data and see what the model learns from the data. And then you do a model evaluation. So then you give it some new data and see how the model is reacting, whether it is meeting expectations or not, right? Then obviously all models will have parameter tuning and inferences, which are basically derived from what the model is trying to say, right? And then finally you bring in the UI developer to develop to embed your model in their development activities. Finally, you have the model deployment, and then model retraining. As I said, with changing data, you need to kind of keep retraining the model, right? I mean, I'm not sure if anyone of you has worked in forecasting systems. But typically in a forecasting system, what you normally do is you look at a rolling window, right? I mean, you look at the previous 12 months to make the prediction for the next 6 months. But again, the next month you'll go and again you'll make a prediction. You'll use the previous 6 months to make the prediction for the next month, right? So that's a rolling model. Similar to that, we use model retraining here because here the assumption that you do when you work with machine learning is that the data is following a particular pattern. There is a pattern which is being followed, and that is the pattern that you're trying to capture through your model. Okay. Now, obviously, if there is no pattern, then there is a challenge because your model will not be able to predict accurately. Okay, and that is the reason retraining, model retraining is an important part of an ML project or a data science project. Now, let me I actually try to put all of these things into a matrix, right? So saying that these are the various stages, and what is the role of each of these folks here. So you will see that the ML developer or the data scientist is playing, or rather has his presence almost everywhere. Okay, then the ETL person plays a small role out here. Then this is the business data analyst leader who has got a role here in these areas. And again, what is important is that I've only spoken about model deployment and model retraining. I have not spoken about interpreting the results of the model because at the end of the day, people would expect that the model would give some result by which they're able to take some action, right? So that part is also done by the business analyst or the reader here, right? And ML Ops engineer is not just in this part, model deployment training. He or she is also in the model retraining part. And to an extent, they'll also be exposed to all of this model implementation onwards. They'll be exposed to everything. So without knowing all of these things, they cannot just do the model deployment part. So this ML Ops engineer also plays an important role out here. Now, again, as I said, I'm trying to keep this webinar as non-technical as possible. So I will just throw out some names to you guys, but again, don't get overwhelmed by it. Anybody who is, who's inquisitive to learn new things and who has their basics, in mathematics or statistics, they can easily pick this up. So again, you talk about it. You have so many components here. Now, obviously, this talks about the data layer. It talks about the programming layer. It talks about the libraries and so on and so forth. And even visual representation, right? I mean, we're talking about the graphs and charts which are kind of used. So those can be done with Seaborn and Plotly, right? I mean, programming languages like that. Can I request people to go on mute? Hello? Yeah, thank you. So this is some of the things that are typically used, not necessarily. I mean, as I said, this is also a growing list. Okay, I'll not say that it is complete, but again, you will not need all of this for your models. You will need some of these things, right? And that hopefully will kind of help you kind of get started in this area. So when we start, I mean, as I said, the focus more here is about the ML and the AI part. So what do we expect? We expect a working knowledge of basic Python or R, right? I mean, we would prefer an intermediate level person, but basics is good enough. Okay. Knowledge of high school mathematics and statistics. Working knowledge of SQL, if the person is also going to, be responsible for pulling out the data from databases. Lot of self-motivation, patience is one virtue that is really helpful out here, because most of the times you may feel that you might have cracked the model, you are getting the answers, you're getting the solutions, but only when you get the results you realize that it is not predicting, or it's probably badly missing the expected benchmark, right? And more important, evolution through learning. I mean, you should always be ready to learn new things. Okay. I mean, all of us learn from our mistakes, but here you should also be prepared to spend extra time learning what's happening, because this is an evolving field. You have lots and lots of academic papers still coming out in this area, right? New algorithms, better ways of getting accuracy, all of those are coming out. So these are some of the prerequisites for a machine learning model developer role. Okay, so if you talk about programming language, I mean, I'll just skim through this, but just for your information, basics is what we are looking at, but it would always help to have an intermediate level knowledge of any programming language. I mean, again, as I said, Python is just one of the most popular languages used for machine learning, but people are still using R, and Java is also coming up with a lot of new libraries, and so is are the Microsoft tech stack as well, right? So you can learn anyone, I mean, whatever is applicable to you. But at this point of time, I can say that, most of these models will probably work well with Python libraries. So you also have to see, like, okay, it's not about just learning the language, you will have to see what language, what libraries are exposed to you, when you are using a particular tech stack. So that's up to, you, the individual, to kind of take this forward. Right? I mean, mathematics, again, these are like some stuff like you would have all learned. I think most of us would have learned this even before our 10th standard, right? But again, when you say high school mathematics is what it is. All of this is fairly simple. I mean, there's nothing difficult out there. Only thing is that you have to understand that the algorithms are all built on this whole concepts. Statistics, understanding statistics, and taking it to basic level. Again, I would say again, 11th and 12th standard statistics is good enough. Right. Now we will actually talk a little more about machine learning and artificial intelligence, and we'll probably go into the list of algorithms. I'm not saying list of algorithms, the types of machine learning algorithms which are available and what you can do with that. So if I have to kind of summarize, what are the types of machine learning algorithm categories, right? I mean, like subject areas within machine learning, I'll probably start with supervised learning, then I'll go with unsupervised, then I'll go with semi-supervised, then I'll go with reinforcement learning, and then finally I'll go with deep learning. Okay. Let me start with supervised learning. Now, the concept of supervised learning is very, very simple. Okay. You take a child, and for the first time, the child is basically like a baby or something, which is like hardly about a year old, and you show the child an apple. So the child knows that this is an apple. You may have showed the child 2 or 3 times, and next time onwards, the child will automatically say that this is an apple. Okay. Now, if you show the same child an orange fruit, the child will not know. And the reason for that is because you have not taught the child that this is an orange, right? It is the same concept with supervised learning. In supervised learning, what we do is we have a function which maps an input object to the output object. And that function is something that we don't write. The algorithm develops that function. And that algorithm develops that function based on the set of training examples we give. So please note that when you are working with machine learning, there is always a training data or a training set which we refer to. Okay, and this set is used for training the model. Okay, and basically what happens in supervised learning is that you are expected to give an input and an output pair. As in the case, I show a fruit, I tell the child that this fruit is an apple. I show the fruit, I say that this fruit is an orange. And I show this multiple times. Obviously, children or humans are very, very smart. You don't have to show the same thing again and again to them. They will understand it once or twice max. But the systems are not very, very smart. So you will have to train the systems with, probably thousands of records. Okay, so please note, for your model to predict accurately, you really have to train the model hard, because the model does not have an intelligence, or the system does not have an intelligence on its own. Okay, so please note that when you talk about supervised learning, there is something called as an input object, and then there's a desired output value. I mean, people use that term a lot, saying that this is called output is called the labeled value, and input is obviously called the input. They also call the output as a dependent value and the input as the independent value. Okay, so there are multiple terminologies which are used for this. This is a simple example. So you are telling that you're showing these images to the model, and then you're telling the model that, hey, these are called an apple. Okay, so the next time a new image pops up, it will say, I know that this is an apple. This is supervised learning in simple terms. I mean, if I have to explain it in layman terms, this is what supervised learning is, where you are told what it is. Basically, you have somebody to tell you. Now, when you talk about supervised learning types, you have something called as regression. So in regression, the idea is to identify the relationship between the input and the output value. Okay, so you give it a lot of input-output value pairs, and then the algorithm evolves to a level where it is able to understand the relationship fairly confidently. And then when you give it only an input object, it is able to predict an output object. Okay, so that is your supervised learning type regression. Regression is typically used when you have continuous values. Like, for example, the most popular one, or the most simplest one that is very popular out there is, the housing, cost prediction. Like, let's say I am looking for a house in a particular area in the town, right? I'm looking for a 2-bedroom house, I'm looking for a 3-bedroom house, I'm looking for a 4-bedroom house, whatever it is, right? So what are the factors which kind of look at that house, its proximity to, let's say, one central part of the town or the city, its proximity to schools, its proximity to, let's say, some gardens or some parks for children play areas, right? Its proximity to a hospital and stuff like that, and its proximity probably to a metro station where people can move on, right? So these are 4 or 5 factors that I spoke about. So these are nothing but your independent variables, right? So based on that, if I'm going to feed the algorithm a lot of data saying that, okay, if I look at these criteria, this is being met, this is not being met, whatever, right? If I'm able to do that and train the algorithm will be able to tell me, when I give it a house in a particular location with these 4 or 5 attributes, what is the tentative price? That is called as a regression algorithm. Next is classification. In classification, it's fairly simple. You are giving an input and you're expecting a discrete output, whether it has to be in a true or false, whether it has to be an apple or mango or an orange, right? Whether it has to say that, okay, this person is admitted to is provided a credit card or not, right? So you're looking at discrete values, right? There's nothing in between. You don't say that I will give you an output which is which is the midpoint between an apple and an orange. It is not possible, right? So that is the algorithm which handles such requirements. They are referred to as classification algorithms. So you already have your predefined classes or your predefined outputs which are there, okay, and you are training the algorithm. So when the algorithm is shown new data, it will basically look at that and it will understand that, okay, this is one of the class that I'm looking at, and let me kind of map it to this particular class. Like for example, in the case of fruit, it might say, okay, this is an apple. Some examples of supervised learning algorithms, obviously when you do a program or when you do a course, you will go into detail into most of these, where you will see how this is working, in what use cases are these typically used. Each algorithm is used in a typical use case, and what is the level of accuracy, and probably some coding to implement this, using Python or R or however, right? So these are some of the algorithms which actually kind of are listed when you talk about supervised learning algorithms. So decision tree is a supervised learning algorithm, and the enhancement of a decision tree is something called as a random forest. So a random forest has multiple decision trees in it, where the decision points are basically taken in random order. That's the reason it's called a random forest. Applications of supervised learning. We talk about credit card application processing. So obviously there are millions of people who apply for a credit card. So it may not be possible for organizations or banks, to basically check through each one of this in detail. So what they typically do is they will pass on the parameters to an algorithm or to a program, and the program will say that, okay, this person can be given a credit card based on so and so factors, or this person shouldn't be given a credit card based on so and so factors. The housing price prediction is something that I spoke to you guys about. Spam detection is also something that is done using supervised algorithms. It can be implemented using an algorithm called as Naive Bayes algorithm. For those of you who are familiar with probability, Bayes theorem is one of the is the foundations of most of the probability concepts, right? So spam detection is kind of handled through Naive Bayes theorem, and that is the reason, what if you look at your emails, right? Whether it's from Gmail or from others, right? You will see that some of the emails don't even come to you on your inbox. They directly go into the spam folder, because there are certain keywords, there are certain patterns, and there are certain usages from other users, which kind of makes the algorithm detect that, okay, or decide that this is a spam email, right? And it is not a valid email. Next, we will move on to unsupervised learning. Okay, now what we saw was a supervised learning. So as the name suggests, in unsupervised learning, nobody is going to tell you what the output is. You are just given a bunch of data. Okay, you're given a bunch of data. Nobody is going to tell you what the output is. The algorithm is going to identify the characteristics of the data by grouping them, and then it will try to see if that can be given a common label. Okay, the algorithm in this case is not going to give you an output or something, but once you define the common label, you provide a new entity to it. The algorithm will say that, okay, you have classified this as a fruit, so this must be a fruit. Okay, so internally the algorithm will try to group the data based on various parameters, various attributes of the data. Right, for example, if you say it tastes sweet, then you say that it is round in shape, then you can say that it is probably red in color. Then obviously it means an apple, but you're not telling that to the algorithm yet. You may also say, okay, it is round in color, it tastes a little sour, it is round in shape and orange in color, right? So it will not know that is being called an orange, but all that it will know is that whenever it sees something which is spherical in shape, orange in color, and tastes sour, it knows that, okay, it belongs to this particular category. So it will help you identify those groups, and then it will also tell you what are those characteristics of those groups. And then it's up to us, to label it, saying that, okay, that category, let's call it as apples, this category, let's call it as oranges, right? And the next time when it sees, or when it's provided with an input where it basically picks up, something which is spherical, something which is orange in color and tastes sour, it will know that, okay, this is an orange. That's how an unsupervised algorithm works. Okay, typically, it is used in most scenarios, and I'll tell you why it is used in most scenarios, because one, supervised algorithms are, I would say, a little expensive in terms of getting the labeled data. So when you say supervised algorithm, I said there has to be an input. It could be an image, it could be anything, but the output has to be there. And creating the output for thousands of records or thousands of samples, right? Yeah, so that could be a painful or an expensive process. So unsupervised learning doesn't look at all of those things. Unsupervised learning first looks at categorization based on attributes, and then you can give that categorization a name. This is the case of unsupervised learning, right? So in this case, you can see it is able to segregate the apples, the oranges, and the bananas. So this is how unsupervised learning runs, because here you don't see where anybody is selling a model that, hey, this is an apple, this is an orange, this is a banana. Nobody's selling that. Now, obviously, the model will not know that this is an apple, this is an orange, this is a banana. It only knows that there are three clusters, there are three different types of fruits that I have captured here. Now, somewhere we will go and say that this is an apple, this is an orange, this is a banana. And then finally, once we label the clusters, any new entity which actually meets one of these criteria will automatically inherit the label as well. Now, when you talk about unsupervised clustering, the first and foremost common thing that we use is referred to as, clustering. So where you group unlabeled data based on their similarities or differences, right? So once you have the clusters, it's easy for you to proceed. And then later we kind of name those clusters. Then you also have association rules. Okay, so this is typically rather frequently used for market basket analysis, right? Like for example, if you are regularly visiting, let's say, Big Basket app, or if you're going to, let's say, Amazon Fresh, or you go to any of your online groceries, right? The moment you pick up one thing, you may have typically, like for example, let's say, I mean, this is a bad example, but let's say somebody buys a bottle of Coke and then they buy chips along with it, right? And this seems to be a pattern across multiple people. So let's say when a person picks up Coke, immediately at the bottom you will say people who bought this also purchased, and you will see chips out there, right? So that is called association rule mapping. Okay, it's also used by recommendation or recommender systems, right, to provide a recommendation based on a relationship, right? So it means that, okay, the other example is, if somebody is buying a shampoo, right, a hair shampoo, then probably the next logical thing is, are they going to buy some, body soap, or are they going to buy, something else like a, a face cream or something like that, right? So that RAPO is basically seen based on the data that has been collected in the past. Now, obviously, in some cases, it may not be customized. It might be based on the generic pattern that is being observed. But to an extent, in most cases, it is also being customized. Now, this is also a scenario that you will see if you go to, let's say, a Netflix or an Amazon Prime. You will see that these movies are being recommended for you based on your watching patterns, right? So obviously, you're not seeing the recommended movies, right? But you're seeing some movies, and looks like people who have seen other movies also tend to watch the movies that is being recommended for you. So this is all happening because of the association rule of mapping. Okay, so the relationship between two products is mapped, right? And when you buy one product, the other product is automatically recommended to you. Now, you also have certain other things. I will not go deep into this, but just for the record, dimensionality reduction, right? Now, when you start looking at attributes, now some of us may think, okay, there are very few attributes for us to take a decision. How do I do this? The actual scenario is that when you are looking at data points, in some cases, after the business analyst is doing their analysis or thing, they still will come to you with about, let's say, about 500 data points, which will influence the decision. Now, obviously, if you take 500 points and try to build a model with it, right, your model is not going to perform. One, because there are too many attributes, too many complexities out there. Secondly, the accuracy may not meet the expectation. So there is a technique which is referred to as dimensionality reduction, which is actually, even though it's an unsupervised learning type, it is predominantly used in the data preparation stage. Okay, in the data preparation stage, the dimensionality reduction techniques are used to reduce the number of attributes which are going to impact the outcome. Now, these attributes are also called as features or dimensions. Okay. So typically this is used in the part of the data pre-processing stage itself, even though it comes under unsupervised learning. So some examples out here. I mean, I'll start with dimensionality reduction. There's something called as principal component analysis and singular value decomposition. So the idea here is very simple. The idea is to kind of bring down the number of attributes in your input data so that you have a set of legitimate attributes which will give you the result. So it's basically an optimization technique out here, right? In terms of clustering and association rules, here are some of the examples that we have seen. One is the K-means clustering, which is an example where you divide your data set into K different clusters. And depending when you introduce a new object, depending on whichever cluster is closest to that, the new object, this new entity becomes a part of that particular cluster and inherits the same label. A priori algorithms is to do with your patterns or the typical patterns followed by users on a particular website or on a particular app. For example, your market basket analysis. When you talk about unsupervised learning applications, one is market segmentation. So again, based on patterns, it's possible to kind of look at this. Like for example, I'm sure most of you would have observed, right? Go to YouTube, you watch a set of, let's say, music videos, and every time you log into YouTube, be it on your mobile or be it on your laptop, you'll tend to get either the same videos coming back and back again, or you'll get to get similar videos, or you'll also get to seeing that people who saw this also saw this, right? So those are nothing but suggestions which are coming to you from the market segmentation part, or rather recommendation engine part. Anomaly detection is also one widely accepted application of unsupervised learning, where you keep studying patterns, and whenever you detect an anomaly, you kind of call it out. So anomaly is nothing but a deviation from the regular pattern. And this is what is typically used for credit card frauds, or when you go to an ATM and when you normally extract, let's say, 5,000 rupees on one particular day, or 2 particular days, you are trying to kind of empty your bank account. Your bank is obviously going to be suspicious. Now, how is the bank going to know whether what you're doing is right or wrong? They will look at your spending patterns, and based on spending pattern, they will say that, okay, this doesn't seem to be this person. And now, how do they kind of identify a spending pattern? Because they know where all you have been using your cards, how long, how much money do you normally withdraw, right? And they have been observing this data, collecting this data for many years now. So whenever they see a change in that pattern, they will immediately feel that, okay, I need to flag this up, or at least let me call up that person and customer and find out whether the customer is really involved in this activity or not, right? Now, we also go to semi-supervised learning. So what we have seen so far is both supervised learning and unsupervised learning. We go to semi-supervised learning. Now, what is semi-supervised learning? As the name suggests, right? Semi-supervised learning is a mix of both supervised and unsupervised learning. Now, why do we need semi-supervised learning? Now, as I said, supervised learning is expensive in terms, not in all scenarios, but in some scenarios, obviously it is expensive. And when I say expensive, I mean it is expensive in terms of the effort that needs to go in labeling of data. Untagged data, unlabeled data is there in plenty everywhere. Untagged data and unlabeled data is there in plenty everywhere. Now, I do not know how many of you would have, I'm sure all of you would have clicked on some, CAPTCHA, right, where it says that, prove that you're a human, and it shows you some 9 images or something, and then says, click on this images where you see a yacht, or where you see a traffic signal, or where you see a mountain, or where you see a bicycle, or where you see a bus, things like that, right? So basically, it is not basically to detect that you are a human. It is basically to help them label those things, that this image has, a bicycle in it. This image has a yacht in it. This image has a mountain in it. You are helping them actually. Okay. Now, organizations, sometimes use that to kind of, that kind of a strategy to help them kind of collect more labeled data. But that cannot be done everywhere, right? That definitely cannot be done everywhere. So in such scenarios, you typically go for semi-supervised learning, right? I mean, very few use cases out there in the public domain, but I'm sure organizations have many use cases for this, right? So what you do in semi-supervised learning is you take a data set, okay, or you're provided with a data set where a small amount of the data is labeled, but a large amount of it is not labeled. Okay, and what you do is with the labeled data, you train your model. With the labeled data which is provided to you, you train your model. Now that you have your model, take some of the unlabeled data and see what your model predicts. What your model predicts. The model will come up with some prediction because you have provided some labeled data. As soon as it observes some characteristic, it will predict something, right? Now, in statistics, okay, there is something called as a confidence interval. We will learn something called as a confidence interval when you're working with statistics. Confidence interval will tell you the amount of confidence that is there by the model, okay, for predicting an activity. So obviously, higher the confidence interval, it means that you are going more towards an accurate prediction. Okay, so in this set of data, which is unlabeled, and for which has been given to the model, look for those elements where the confidence interval is high. Okay, you could define your threshold, but look for those elements where your confidence interval is high. And what you do there is take those elements, okay, validate them. Because your confidence interval is high, the probability is that you have predicted that correctly. Okay, and then incorporate those elements also in your list of labeled data. So basically, what are you doing? You are taking a data set, you have taken labeled data, you have trained a model on it. Now what you're doing next is you're going to go ahead, take that model and put it out, put some unlabeled data there. Look for those elements where the confidence level is high, incorporate them as part of your labeled data and train your model again. Now what happens in this case is that now this is an iterative process, right? So over a period of time, your model has been trained to a level where its prediction accuracy will be much better than the original model, which was actually predicted, which was actually trained on a small data set. Now that is what is referred to as semi-supervised learning. So in semi-supervised learning, there is an element of supervised learning involved. There's an element of unsupervised learning involved. Okay. So this is the definition. I mean, most of the definitions, semi-supervised, unsupervised, supervised, and all have been taken from Wikipedia. Okay, so most of these are just Wikipedia definitions. Now here is what it is pictorially to represent this. A few labeled data. There is an initial classifier optimization which goes in, and then this classifier is kind of exposed to the many unlabeled data. Okay, and based on the characteristics that it understands, it will kind of classify some of them with high prediction and low prediction, and whatever is high, you kind of take it back and retrain the classifier again. So this is the process of semi-supervised learning. Now there are some assumptions that the data that you're going to share in this group for a semi-supervised learning is continuous, which means that it is kind of at least in alignment with some patterns or some behaviors of the data, some attributes of the data, right? It's also assumed that it can be in the form of one of the many clusters because typically what happens is for the unlabeled data, you probably use cluster algorithms to kind of classify the clusters. So it's assumed that somewhere your data is going to be part of one cluster. And it's also assumed that compared to the entire data set, you're looking at a small subset for your training. That's the reason we use the term a manifold assumption out there. Where is this applied? This is applied in speech analysis in order to recognize voices. You know, you have your voice recognition systems, right? Especially where multiple people can record their voices and the system knows who's talking, right? So that is done through semi-supervised algorithms. Content classification, right? You take about 100 or 1,000 documents and you classify them saying that, okay, this content is positive, this content is not positive, right? And then expose the algorithm, train the algorithm in this, and then expose it to a lot of unclassified or unlabeled content. It will be able to do a good job there. And again, from a bioinformatics perspective, even protein sequence classification can be done using semi-supervised algorithms. Before we go to deep learning, the last thing that we will look here is called reinforcement learning. Now, reinforcement learning, if I have to explain it, let me start with the example first, and then we will get to it. Right? Okay. So, for example, let's say you have a puppy at home, and you want to train it to shake hands. It's a typical thing that all of us do, right? And we want to make sure that we want to train our puppy. Right? Obviously, the puppy does not understand English. It does not understand our language as well, whatever we speak, right? So when you kind of show your palm, okay, first the puppy may not understand what it is. First it may lick your palm or it may do whatever it is. But finally, when it runs out of options and it puts its paw on your hands, what would you do? If you tell it great, awesome, fantastic, the puppy is still not going to understand. What you normally do is you give it a treat, a small treat, right? So the moment the puppy gets the treat, it knows that it has done something which is correct. Okay. After some time, when you again put your hand out there in front of the pup may not immediately remember that it has to put its paw there, but it will know that it had done something in the past which got it a treat, right? So the pup will try to do everything possible, and finally, again, it might probably give you its paw to you, and then you may again give it a treat, right? So now, after 2 or 3 such incidents, your puppy is now smart enough to realize that, okay, if I'm going to raise my paw and give it to this person in his or her hand, then I'm going to get a treat, right? So that makes it do more confident, do this thing more confidently, right? That's exactly what happens in the scenario of reinforcement learning. In the reinforcement learning, if I have to take this example, your puppy is nothing but the agent. Okay, and the puppy is in the agent, and we are the environment. We are part of the environment. Okay, now if the puppy is performing an action which gives it a reward, okay, which is actually to give the paw, then we give it a reward which goes to it immediately. Okay, and then we modify our state. Okay, and what happens is over a period of time, the agent knows that whenever I raise my hand or palm, the puppy has to put its paw there. Okay, and that is what is referred to as reinforcement learning. So if you look at the English definition of reinforcement, it is basically to kind of reiterate, or supplement something with an additional reward so that the person is kind of motivated. So for example, if say I want to reinforce the concepts of machine learning in this group today. So which means that I'm going to probably talk back to you about or revise some of the concepts that we have learned. That's what reinforce means, right? So the same concept is what is applied out here. So it is different as a machine learning method that is concerned with how software agents should take actions in an environment. Now, obviously, the agent doesn't know what is the outcome or what is the expected outcome, but the agent knows that, if the agent does a set of steps, there is a reward, or if the agent does a set of steps, there's no reward. So obviously, the agent is motivated to work towards the reward. Okay. Some terms, I mean, I'll not go through this, but again, these are the terms which are typically used when you're talking about an agent, and especially in the case of reinforcement learning. So again, there is positive reinforcement, there's negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when you give it a reward. Negative reinforcement is when you give it a penalty, right? So if the pup is putting its, if it's trying to lick your paw, if you kind of beat it, that is negative reinforcement. So both have its has its pros and cons depending on the use case that you are working on. It is something that is to be decided whether you want to go with positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. Now, having said that, I mean, very few use cases in the commercial industry for reinforcement learning. But yes, I mean, there are definitely out there. Models famous in reinforcement learning methods are the Markov's decision process and the Q-learning. Okay, so again, there's a lot of article out there in the net on YouTube that you can go through to understand this in detail. Where is reinforcement learning typically used? Robotics, business strategy planning, and games. Right? Robotics. I'm sure if you're not done this, please go to YouTube and you can look at a website called as Boston Dynamics. So Boston Dynamics makes a lot of robots, and they give a demo of these robots, right? And a lot of these robots, if you see, these robots are capable of climbing up stairs, coming down stairs, jumping from one step to the other step, right? And even if they fall down, they are resilient, made resilient enough that they can get up on their own. So most of it is done using reinforcement learning in terms of some of the decisions that they take. Now we will move on to deep learning. When I say deep learning, we're not going to go deep into this, but we will see how much we can cover here. So the reason why we are talking about deep learning is because deep learning involves training of neural networks. And when I use the term neural networks, as the name suggests, this particular set of concepts within the area of artificial intelligence or machine learning is kind of mimicked on the human brain. Okay, so there is a little bit of trivia here about the human brain that you'll find interesting, right? I mean, like a human has 100 billion neurons, and as you get older, they kind of lose their sharpness and their efficiencies. But when you are young and all, they are fairly good. So we are only worried about three parts where we say that there is a cell body, there is dendroids, and there is axon, right? Axon is used to transmit the output of the neuron to the next neuron, and dendrite is used to receive signals from the previous neuron to this neuron, right? And each neuron can be connected to at least 10,000 other neurons. So then you can understand how complex our neural network is, right? And if you are extremely efficient in terms of what you do, I mean, in terms of your brain capacity, then you can store up to 1,000 terabytes of information inside your head. So that's how powerful your mind is. And that is the reason neural networks are modeled after how the mind works. Okay. So they are a set of algorithms modeled loosely after the human brain that are designed to recognize patterns. Now, where do we use neural networks or deep learning? We don't use it for computation. Why? Because if I'm going to ask you a question randomly, right? I mean, hey, one of you say, what does 15 into 7s are? So I'm sure when I use that term 15 into 7, what is running inside your mind is, okay, you say, okay, 15 into 5s are 75, 15 into 6 are 90, whatever, right? So that is because you have by-hearted this, you have mugged this, okay? But if I show you a mobile phone from any angle, any direction, even if I show you a part of the mobile phone and I ask you, what is it? If I show it to you in a dark room also, you will tell me that it's a mobile phone. That is because that is where you are using your senses, but you're not using your senses when I ask you for 15 into 7s. You're not using it. That's where you go back to your calculator mode, right? So to do things that are associated with your senses, right, which is like recognition, okay, speech, translation, right? Those are things for which you will need neural networks, and deep learning precisely does that. You create neural networks. I mean, obviously, so we're talking about artificial neural networks. You create artificial neural networks and you train them. Right? and you train them, and then the artificial neural network, after a lot of training, is able to do what you want it to do. This is the typical representation of a neural network, where you talk about an input layer where you're presenting the data. Now, this input layer means it's a single sample, but again, for the sake of computer which does not have, the sensory organs like your nose or your ear or your eyes, everything has to be converted in the form of bits and bytes and shared it as inputs, right? So be it a sound file, be it a image file, be it a movie, whatever it is, right? You just have to convert it into bits and give it to the neural network as an input layer. Then there are a lot of hidden layers. Now, hidden layers are like a black box. I do not know what exactly is going on there. That is the reason it's called a hidden layer. Okay. Now, as an ML modeler or someone, you will be allowed to define how many hidden layers you want and how many neurons you want in each of those hidden layers, right? And you train your model. You train. I mean, please note that in all of these things, without training the model with the data, you cannot get results, right? So you again start training your model here. And here you define what is the output that you're looking for. In this case, there is, output can be n different classes. So it could be an object recognition one, right? I mean, character or digit recognition, or it could be, I have one image, I need to identify what is all there in that single image, right? So it could be any of those things, okay? But all that we know about is what is going in as input, what is going in as output. This middle layer is something which the algorithm handles. So which actually makes it easier for us because we don't have to sit and write down the logic or code for this thing to function. The only thing that we need to provide is the processing power and the amount of data. Okay. Now, if I have to take a single node, so here you're seeing each one of this is a node. Okay, here's the input layer, this is the output layer. So here each one is a neuron. Now for each of these neurons, this is how it appears, right? So you have your input, which can have, let's say, m+1 attributes here. For each of these attributes, you apply a weight. Okay, again, you apply a random weight. The model will evolve and it will refine the weight itself as a part of the training process. So once you provide the inputs along with the weight actually goes into the neuron, okay, which is defined here, this neuron. And in the neuron, there is a function which applies it, and then there is an activation function. Okay. Again, activation function, we have a sigmoid function, we have a ReLU function, we have a tanh function, we have many functions that all can be random. Okay, don't worry about it at all. I mean, the interesting part about neural networks is that the system takes care of everything. Okay, so once this part is taken randomly, right, it provides an output. Now, imagine a system where you're talking only about 5 or 6 layers of networks, neurons, and each layer has about 256 neurons. And you are providing, let's say, a couple of million records or a couple of million examples, right? So by the time this whole thing goes, so the reason why we call this as a neural network is because one, as I said, the input layer goes through the multiple layers. Now, please note that as you can see in this, within a particular layer, a part of the input layer will only go to one neuron. It will not go to other neurons, and it moves on to the next thing, right? Now, by the time it reaches this particular spot, it would have arrived at some kind of a conclusion or a prediction about the output. Now, when it comes to the output, when it finds that the output is not the same as its prediction, this feedback will be given back saying that your prediction is off by, let's say, 10% or off by about 20%. So again, this feedback goes back, okay, goes back into the neural network, and the weights are adjusted. The weights that I'm talking about here, they are adjusted. Now the weights are going to be different for each neuron at each layer. So if I am going to talk about, let's say, n neurons in about m layers, then there are going to be m into n weights available there. Okay, and that m into n into probably I should rephrase it. Like, let me just call it as XYZ. Okay, X input components, Y layers, and Z neurons. So it is going to be X into Y into Z is the total number of weights which is going to be available here. And based on the output correction, this is going to go back and forth till a point where after training all the examples, your neural network knows exactly what to predict, what not to predict. Okay, I mean, I have tried to explain it in a very layman terms, but the technical thing for this is we call it as, the back propagation. So you propagate forward and it kind of also comes back. So the output is being used to refine the model internally. So neural networks take a lot of time to train, right? And they also need GPU capabilities. So typically we recommend the usage of Google Colab, which is a thing that's available from Google for training neural networks. So here's your net input function. You have an activation function which is applied on the output of this input function. And the activation function will give an output. And this is what happens at each and every neuron here. Okay. Now, the good thing is we don't have to know about all of these things because internally the system takes care of everything. Now, when you talk about deep learning, right? Deep learning is where you have multiple layers inside the hidden layer. Okay. A hidden layer can even be a single layer or it can be multiple layers. When you have multiple layers, it's called as deep learning. Okay. If you have only a single layer, it's called as a shallow neural network. If you have multiple layers, it's called a deep learning network. Again, depending on the complexity of the problem that you're trying to solve, you decide on the number of layers, you decide on the number of neurons. And obviously, it also depends on the computing power that's available to you. Some of the applications, I mean, there are plenty of interesting applications with, neural networks and deep learning, right? I mean, colorization of black and white images, adding sound to silent movies, automatic machine translation, right? I mean, object classification in photographs, automatic handwriting generation, not detection, generation, character text generation, image characterization. So basically, you have trained your model to identify a lot of images, right? And then you put this on an image caption generation. You are writing an image caption generation where you provide the image and then the model tells you what is happening in that particular image. Like for example, models have developed to an extent where the model can actually tell you, like for example, if you're taking, let's say you're talking about a soccer game, right? A player A is moving from one region to the other region. The model can give a running commentary. So to that level of, to that extent, models have advanced, right? And obviously automatic gameplay, right? So these are some very interesting, I would say applications of deep learning, okay? But in most corporate sectors where their data is structured and stuff like that, it is mostly the machine learning part which comes into play. Deep learning is kind of not very, very common, but having said that, deep learning is definitely there. Again, I am not going into the details of all of these things at this point of time, but I just thought I will talk quickly about convolutional neural networks and recurrent neural networks. So typical application of convolutional neural networks is in the area of vision, computer vision, right? I mean, you take an image, you want to analyze it. Okay, you take a video, you want to analyze it. You want to basically tell whether a video is a violent video or it is a peaceful video or whatever for classification purposes, right? Recurrent neural networks, typically used in scenarios like language processing, natural language processing, right? And sometimes when you start typing in chat or typing in your email, you will see that next words are automatically kind of being shown to you. If you click a tab, then probably those words you don't have to type it on, right? That is an excellent example of recurrent neural networks, especially something to do with sequential data. This is an example of convolutional neural network, right? You have an image. That image actually is going through what we refer to as a convolution. Okay, so in a convolution, basically what happens is you pass a kernel, you pass the image data through a kernel, and that kernel is going to give you something referred, which we call as a feature map. And the feature map is what the feature map along with the ReLU function, which is the activation function. Okay, you collect a lot of those things and then you decide you want to pool them because here your data is huge. Even after the convolutional activity, your data is huge. So you want to do a pooling of it where you basically take some 4 pixels, look at the maximum value of the pixel and stuff like that. So in terms of pooling, we typically refer to as max pool, average pool and all. Again, depends on the problem statement that you're trying to solve. You'll have to pick up one of these things, right? And then again, you may want to pass it on. So at the end of the day, all of this is basically, added just basically to increase the accuracy, increase the accuracy of your system. So if you see this seems to be a model where, and then finally, at the end, the reason it's called convolutional neural network is once it reaches a final point, you are connecting it to a normal neural network. And here in this case, we call it as a fully connected neural network. Now, why do we say fully connected neural network? It's because every input attribute here, okay, is fully connected to every neuron in each layer in some form or the other. That is the reason it's called fully connected. So here, till here you have an image. You flatten the image to get your attributes. So depending on the number of pixels of your image, you'll get so many number of attributes, and then you again put them into a neural network, and then at the end you get your classification, right? So this seems to be an image where you're classifying the photo and the image, and you're saying whether it's a car, truck, van, or a bicycle, right? So this is a simple, I would say, representation of a new CNN architecture. So this is how the whole thing works. Passes through multiple layers, could be convolutional layer. Then after convolutions, it goes through a pooling layer. Then there is flattening of data. Then it goes into a fully connected neural network, and then you finally get the output. Okay. But the network over a period of time is smart enough to understand, whether it is making the right judgment or not. But there's a lot of effort that goes into it. Even though when we use it in applications, it sounds very simple and it sounds magical and interesting. There's a lot of effort that goes into it, and that is also one of the reasons why data science folks are in huge demand, because they put in that effort. Now, last thing that we're going to see is about recurrent neural networks. As I said, this is typically used when you want to predict sentences, right? Now, when you want to predict sentences, one of the things that you need to keep in mind is you need to know the current state. You also need to know the past state as well, past value, right? So I will not go into this. This is a little complex, but recurrent neural networks is typically used for predicting statements and is used for sequential in sequential or time series related activities. Like for example, machine translation, right? So from one language to another language, you want to translate it. This will do a good job there. So I think we just, just 5 minutes over 12. I'm sorry that we started a little late because I thought we would be waiting for some more participants. Any questions? I'll stop sharing my screen.
Hi, this is Manish here.
Yes, Manish.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would like to ask the basics ones, like how will we distinguish between a data scientist and an AI engineer?
See, again, Manish, to be very candid, this definition or the designation title, right, is very confusing. Okay, because in some organizations, they'll give you that designation as a data scientist. In some organizations, they'll call you as an ML engineer 1 or ML engineer 2. It basically depends on what you do. I mean, if you ask me about what is the pure definition of a data scientist, it is probably the guy who is sitting in a university who has probably done his PhD and who is writing.
So most of the things that like the ETL and those things, like those kind of things, I have seen majorly being done by some data platform team who are actually doing some ETL jobs and
Yes.
making the data in a format which can be understandable by the data analyst, so that they can run their R or Python or their analytics engine over the same.
True.
And
True. That's what
the
happens.
job. Okay.
So no.
The
I mean,
other
all
one
that I'm
is,
trying to say, Manish, is your question is very valid, right? I mean, a person who is working on the building the model, training the model, and fine tuning the parameters, right? That person is actually the ML model developer, but for all practical purposes in software organizations, we call them as a data scientist.
okay.
The ML researcher, you will find very, very few ML researchers. I mean, people who can understand the mathematics behind something, who can actually identify how to tweak an algorithm itself. We don't tweak an algorithm here. We are only fine-tuning the parameters of an algorithm when you talk about what we do in our organizations.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard like kind of terms, multi-arm band data, those things are there. So yeah. Another one is like machine learning will be like a sub part of the artificial intelligence, right? It's
Yes,
a part of it.
it's part of artificial intelligence. That's correct. Any other questions, Manish?
No, I'm done. I'm okay.
Okay. Any other questions? I hope all of you found this webinar. I mean, as I said, we didn't want to go into depth because we just wanted to give an overview of what AI and ML is, especially for people who are trying to understand what this field is all about, and how much of effort or what should be required to get into this field and how to work on it, right? So, I hope this webinar has been helpful to you guys. Thank you for making your time again on a Saturday morning, right? If you need anything, please do get in touch with Stalwart Learning. Okay. Thank you and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Krishna.
Hi, Krishna. Thank you so much for such a great webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.